In a section of his CRT briefing book called Race Essentialism, Rufo claims that critical race theory reduces individuals to the quasi-metaphysical categories of blackness and whiteness, then loads those categories with value connotations. Positive traits are attributed to blackness and negative traits are attributed to whiteness. This claim is literally the exact opposite of what critical race theory contends. Race essentialism is a belief in a genetic or biological essence that defines all members of a racial category. In fact, as I previously noted, critical race theorists explicitly argue that the concept of race is not a biological reality, but in fact a social construct, and even more than that, a legal construct. That is to say that the very existence of race as a concept in America was actually created in part by our legal system. And frankly, it's hard to argue with that assertion considering the fact that in the infamous Dred Scott decision regarding runaway slaves, the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, an asshole, stated that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. There may not be any inherent biological differences between the races beyond the superficial characteristics of skin color in reality, but the system of laws and their enforcement in our nation created a very real legal difference between white people and black people that carries a very real and material legacy to this day. The very fact that this country had laws against interracial marriage until 1967 is an example of this legal construction of race. And that legal construction helped create and reinforce the social construction of race in America, which is the only reason we are even fucking talking about any of this at all right now. Also, wokeness! And this little detour into our history of the long-standing impact of our racist laws gives us some insight into what this grift is all about. And considering the fact that Rufo has made Ibram X. Kendi one of the primary villains in this manufactured hysteria about critical race theory, I think it's only fair and balanced, TMCR, to ask Kendi himself what he thinks this is all about.
I think what's being described as critical race theory is any analysis, critical analysis of race or racism in this country that does not position this country as post-racial. Any attempt to hold people who are being racist accountable. Any attempt to have a clear and complex and multivariate approach to American history whereby we actually document and talk about and teach about the history of racism in this country.
Now, I think Kendi might be onto something here, because it's pretty clear that the focus of the anti-critical race theory phenomenon has been largely centered around the teaching of our history, specifically with regards to the history of racism in America. And speaking of history, it's worth reiterating that all of this anti-critical race theory mania is unambiguously a backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement that coalesced into the largest sustained protest movement in American history over the summer of 2020, animated by the fact that the entire nation watched in horror as a white police officer pressed his knee onto George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, amidst a crowd of people begging the officer to spare Floyd's life. With his hands casually placed in his pockets, it was clear that this police officer believed that George Floyd had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And one of the most significant aspects to this movement that was different from other black liberation movements of the past was that this movement included a whole lot of white people, including a lot of white people who grew up in the era of colorblindness and were learning about the devastating impact of racism in our society for the first time in their lives. And so, in addition to the increased awareness of systemic racism that took place as a result of this movement throughout our society, it's not that surprising that this moment has also included some misguided excesses and cynical efforts of appropriation. Clumsy conversations about race in school board meetings, efforts by corporations or the military to adopt anti-racist language or make symbolic gestures in hopes of deflecting from the structural critiques of racism and capitalism that implicate them, and some cringy virtue signaling by people that may have taken the writings of Robin DiAngelo a bit too far. Side note, it's pretty funny that one of the things that set this off is a book called White Fragility, which led a bunch of white people to flip out and try to ban any discussion of race. For all the book's flaws, maybe, at the very least, the title was onto something. And so part of the enormous backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement, as Rufo explicitly stated, was to put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category of critical race theory. It didn't matter that Robin DiAngelo was not a critical race theorist, or that her emphasis on the racist beliefs held by individuals was actually at odds with critical race theory's focus on more systemic and legal critiques, or that her participation in diversity training programs for corporations restricted her from leveling an honest assessment of capitalism's role in systemic racism. The fact is that this reactionary backlash was not interested in a conversation about actual critical race theory. The goal was to label any effort to examine the impact of racism in our society as critical race theory, and make sure that when people heard that term, they had a negative association with it. To put it more simply, by cutting out the middleman, they wanted people to have a negative association with any examination of racism in our society, and particularly throughout our history. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.